So of course, Richard Dawkins and his xenophobic sentiments, I make reference to that, and I make reference also to Lawrence Krauss and his association with Jeffrey Epstein, meaning Richard Dawkins' association with Jeffrey Epstein, but of course Donald Trump's association, people are making something of his association now with Jeffrey Epstein also. But why I mention this in that context is that if a cleric of any religion was found doing something, some misdeeds, that becomes an argument against religion. In the case of Al-Islam, if someone who ascribes themselves to Al-Islam, like the grooming gangs, that would be made as an argument against the deen of Al-Islam. This, in fact, which we will cover in chapter 1, is one of the many fallacies that is utilized today in today's propaganda against Al-Islam. What else I mention is that the claim, they say that Islam or belief in God is a danger to civilization. So that was the propaganda of New Atheism. And one of the proponents of New Atheism was Christopher Hitchens. So Christopher Hitchens, he was the author of the book, God is Not Great. Of course, a clear reference to us when we say Allahu Akbar, Allah is great. So he wrote a book, God is Not Great. And he was a proponent of the invasion of Iraq. Now Iraq was ruled by Saddam Hussein, and Saddam Hussein, his regime was secular. Within secular Iraq, you had all the religions. Tariq Aziz, his general, was a Christian, but yet they referred to this as a secular crusade. So what he states regarding this, he says, this is Christopher Hitchens, he says, I think it's us plus the 82nd Airborne and the 101st, who are the real, reference to the air jets, the fighters, who are the real fighters for secularism at the moment, the ones who are really fighting the main enemy. Now the main enemy in this case was the Iraqi regime, Saddam Hussein. So Saddam Hussein, this was a new atheist, Christopher Hitchens, a proponent of the invasion of Iraq to overthrow a secular Ba'athist regime, a secular regime, but utilizing secularism to overthrow a secular regime and claiming at the same time they are imposing secularism in an already secular country. But then what I mentioned to that is this was said as part of the backdrop to Hitchens' support of the invasion of Iraq on the unsubstantiated pretext of it having weapons of mass destruction, and Saddam's alleged support of Al-Qaeda, both false claims as became quite clear from the intelligence gathered once the invasion had taken place. So this was the pretext to invade Iraq. Why am I mentioning this at the beginning of the introduction? To inform the young Muslims that atheism is politically motivated. The promotion of new atheism is a political movement. It has no sincerity to your well-being. It has no sincerity to the outcome of your hereafter and your worldly life. But yet so many young Muslims, they have been brainwashed by new atheism in its various forms. So on that same page, I mention, for instance, the depleted uranium that was utilized in Iraq. Over 300,000 depleted uranium rounds were estimated to have been fired during the 2003 Iraq war. And the vast majority of them by the United States of America, whom Christopher Hitchens supported. And then other facts are mentioned, like 88,500 bombs were dropped on Iraq and Kuwait in 1991. The equivalent of 7 Hiroshimas fell on populated areas. And this was the claim of New Atheism, that Islam is violent. So post 9/11 they were saying Islam is violent, but the level of propaganda was such that these secular countries were bombing populated areas with depleted uranium, as well as these bombs that were dropped, which we observe in Gaza also. The war on Gaza and Palestine, on the West Bank and the entire Palestinian population, that war that we are witnessing is a secular war against Islam. But the counterclaim is made that Islam is violent. So the level of propaganda is encapsulated in that statement that I mentioned. Now, what I mentioned on page 5 is Hitchens was a journalist and a militant atheist. His sentiments and his support for war abroad resembles something that Winston Churchill said about Kurds and others when Britain divided the Ottoman Muslim territories. So the Ottoman Caliphate was divided in 1924, and during that time the Kurds were supporters of the Caliphate. There was a sheikh called Sheikh Saeed. He was a supporter of the Caliphate. What did they do? They gassed many of the Kurds. So Winston Churchill, he said, I do not understand the squeamishness about the use of gas. I am strongly in favor of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes. That was the attitude towards the Kurds by Winston Churchill. And prior to Churchill, of course, that was the common policy. But then New Atheism, the likes of Christopher Hitchens, they were also a part of this extermination of native peoples of different lands. So I mention further down Richard Dawkins again as the Pope of New Atheism. And I also refer to him as a social media troll, because he would write many tweets, the likes of which I quote one of the citations on page 6. He writes, listening to the lovely bells of Winchester, one of our great medieval cathedrals. So this is an atheist praising the bells of the cathedral. And then he says, so much nicer than the aggressive sounding Allahu Akbar. Or is it just my cultural upbringing? So this tells you the nature of these people, that there is an inherent hatred towards Islam and Muslims, irrelevant to whether they claim that it is based upon some logical grounds. There is an inherent hatred towards Islam specifically. This is a militant atheist who is praising the bells of a church and yet refers to the Allahu Akbar as sounding aggressive. He has not heard the adhan, or he has heard the adhan and pretends that he has not heard the adhan being recited beautifully, as it is in many Muslim countries. So